39, Genesis 39, Joseph the comeback kid. Genesis 39 is essentially about the temptation of Joseph in Egypt. God's future leader is going to be tested to reveal his character, a character that could be trusted with leadership. What would Joseph do with his terrible circumstance that he has experienced and will experience? How would he pass the test? Can we rightly call him the comeback kid, right? Hard circumstances he's facing. He'll face a moral testing as well, but at the same time, it's going to reveal his character and his desire to please God. So if Joseph is going to be God's leader, he's going to have to show himself faithful to God. And in this, in chapter 39, he gives us an excellent example of how to come back from hard circumstances and overcome temptation even. So Genesis chapter 39, let's look at verses 1 to 6. And remember, this is on the heels of learning about Judah and him being essentially a carnal believer, while Joseph here is an exemplary believer. Genesis 39, verse 1 to 6, and Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph. Key phrase. You'll find that phrase 4 times in this chapter. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hands. And it came to pass from that time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. So Joseph got in charge of everything except the food, right? And so here we have Joseph, recently sold into slavery by his brothers. You know, back in Hebron, back in the Promised Land, with his father and his brothers, remember that his brothers had despised him, thought he was a dreamer, troublemaker. But in Egypt here, he is becoming a blessing. He is becoming a source of blessing because of that phrase. You'll see it in verse 2 and verse 3, and you'll also see it in verses 21 and verse 23. The Lord was with him. So God had promised, remember, that God had promised to Abraham that his descendants would bring blessing to the nations, right? I'll bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. And in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, the verse goes, and I will bless them that bless thee, curse them that curseth thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So right now, we are seeing that Joseph is a Psalm 1 man. You know, he's got the Midas touch. Everything he touches, prosperity, gold. He is doing Psalm 1. And Potiphar acknowledges it. Potiphar trusted Joseph enough so that Potiphar now is perhaps the first nation, at least in regards to Joseph, the first nation or the first non-believer to be blessed by a covenant person, okay, by a person of God. He's the first to enjoy a share of that promised blessing, which was first started and promised to Abraham, but would go through his descendants and unto the world. So we see here Joseph, the comeback kid. What happened again? Joseph becomes a faithful and highly effective servant in Potiphar's house, and it says Potiphar is a captain of the guard. So this is no small person in the government of Egypt. He is the captain of the palace guard. He is a high-ranking official, a cabinet member of the presidency, right, of the king. Pharaoh is a title. And so he is in Pharaoh's house. Now, if you think about it, Joseph is a good example of a believer who trusted God and made the best of where he was at. He was in the pit and imprisoned, but he's going to come back, right? The comeback kid. He'll show us that even though, remember the word of God that Joseph had at this time? He didn't. There was no written word of God as far as we know. It was oral tradition being passed down from his great-great-grandpa, right? Abraham, the believer. This is what God said to me, and Abraham told it to his son Isaac. Isaac told it to his sons Jacob and Esau. Jacob probably told it to his sons, the promises, that it would pass down and pass on to the whole world. And so we have Joseph living out the principles that he didn't read about in James 1. Remember what James 1 said about temptations or trials? Okay, I'll start it with the word see. Ready? Count. What is the rest of the word? Count it all joy when you fall into diverse trials, circumstances. Joseph didn't have that. He didn't have those promises from 1 Peter. He didn't have those promises from James chapter 1 to count it joy when you fall into temptations or trials. But he lived it out. He practiced those principles because the Lord was with him. Okay, those are the two phrases. And again, the promises that Abraham had, and also, what else did Joseph have to feed off of? The dreams, the vision that he had. God gave me a dream. One day I will be essentially a ruler and a king. So I'm going to live like it. I'm going to participate in God's program. I'm not going to allow anything to dissuade me from that purpose that God has for me. So Joseph would rather be at home, no doubt, because it's better than the circumstances here. I was watching last night the news, and they were interviewing people from Panama City. And they're at a gas station. They interviewed one man. He goes, you know what? It's going to hit right where we're at. I'm going to go ahead and leave. And they said, where are you going to go? He said, I'm going to Disney World. He said, we got lemons. I'm going to make lemonade. And so here is Joseph, in the pit, imprisoned, sold as a slave. He's got lemons. But in this, he's making lemonade. So he is really the comeback kid. He's a great example of somebody who trusts God and made the best of his difficult circumstances. And the blessing is so real. We see in verse 2 and 3, the blessing was very evident. And in verse 5, it says, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. Now, this is not just a normal, regular, hey, this person's a hard worker, so he's getting results. This is a supernatural, unexpected, full blessing. The Lord is with him, so much so that Potiphar had to admit, back in verse 5, look, the Lord is with this guy. Everything he touches, he's got the Midas touch. Everything he's touching is turned to gold. He's truly the Psalm 1 type of a guy. So no doubt Joseph had a positive attitude. He had a hard worker ethic. He had efficiency, effectiveness. And so Potiphar appoints him as the manager, the overseer of the whole house. Now, according to archaeological records, the rich Egyptians during that time typically had a 2 or 3 story house. The slaves would live on the bottom floor, taking care of all the resources and all the things that are needed for the household, while the family would enjoy the upper 2 levels, fresh food, fruits and vegetables, live entertainment. And so that was where he was being a household manager now. So there's a supernatural blessing upon him. Potiphar gradually gives him more and more responsibility until the point he actually starts becoming the manager of everything in the house except for the food, right? According to that verse 6. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and he knew not aught he had save the bread, which he did eat. So he's an honest man. He's a faithful worker. No doubt that testimony carried around in all of the household, in all of the servants' quarters, all of the family members. He was well liked, even though he lived and worked in a pagan, idol-worshiping setting. So here is a man living out his faith in a pagan atmosphere, giving testimony to the living God. So much so that Potter says, surely the Lord is with this guy. Everything he touches is gold. And so he is being definitely a testimony because of his character, because of his hard work, because of his abilities here. And if you think about it, if he had stayed back home, if he wasn't sold into slavery, if he was back home with Israel, Jacob, he would have been pampered, spoiled, hated even more so by the brothers, the other 10 brothers. And so here God is allowing this difficult circumstance to build him. I don't know if you've thought about this in regards to your work or your life. God's building program of you, the person, involves giving you a job to do, right, and commands to obey. He's putting you in a workplace where you have to serve a master and do what he says. That's how he builds you. A job to do and words to obey, commands to obey. He gives us hard circumstances to build us and to test us. That's why, in parenting, sometimes parents try to save their kids from the punishment and the hard stuff. But it's exactly the hard stuff and the punishment that builds them. And here's the hard stuff that's building a future man of God, a leader for God's people. So he tests his servants before he promotes them. The parable of the talents. You're faithful with what you got. You got lemons, you made lemonade. You got 5 talents, you made them to 10 talents. And here, Joseph is making lemonade, and he is growing in his character and his conduct, and it's being revealed. And not only was that not only good for Potiphar, but it was good for Joseph and all the people around him. So the description of Joseph here in verse 6 prepares us for the next part of the plot here. So, right, he's got the Midas touch. Everything he's doing is golden, and he's being a testimony. Everybody knows he's a good, hard worker. Everybody knows he's honest, he's efficient, he's effective. And then all of a sudden, verse 6 says, this guy's good looking too. Okay, look at verse 6. And he left all that he had in Joseph's house, and they knew aught that he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well-favored. If you look at the Hebrew, they're very similar. But the actual Jewish commentators say that goodly person means he was well-built. So he was well-built and he was handsome. Now that sets the stage for verse 7. Okay, look at verse 7. Oh, by the way, he looked like his mother Rachel and his great-great-grandmother Sarah. Remember, she was so pretty that Abraham had to lie and say, hey, don't tell them that you're my wife because they'll kill me to marry you. Okay, and same with Rachel, with Jacob. So he's good-looking. He's got character, and now we'll see in verse 7 that he has self-control. Look at verse 7. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, lie with me. So here's the request. She is very blunt, very straightforward. There's no mincing meat, no beating around the bush here. She attempts to seduce Joseph, and she is blunt. Lie with me. But he is blunt right back. Okay? With Joseph here, there's no flirting, there's no debating. Her bluntness is faced with a equal bluntness. Look at verse 8. But he refused and said unto his master's wife, behold, my master wotteth not, that is, knows not what it is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. So he didn't sit down next to her. He didn't share drinks with her. He kept a very clear fence. Okay, very clear fence, a separation from her. So we have that refusal to her advances. And again, this was daily. This was happening every day. This is repeated. And his determined resistance is repeated and repeated. And we see in verse 7 and verse 11 her bluntness, lie with me. But again, no debating, no flirting. He refuses. He's bold right back. He steadfastly refuses day after day the temptation to commit immorality with him or her. He would not betray his master's confidence. Look, my master trusted me with everything. Everything. Right? And so I'm not going to betray him, and I'm not going to sin against God. If you were to read Proverbs chapter 7, 6 through 27, that chapter is an illustration of what's happening here. An evil seductress, a temptress, daily trying to seduce, and here is Joseph daily, determinedly refusing to fall into temptation or to go headlong into temptation. And you have to think, where is he getting his strength from? Okay? Lust is a very powerful force. His refusal, I believe, was strengthened because he knew that God had a special task for him. Remember, he was going to be in a position where his brothers and his mom and dad would bow to him and acknowledge his rulership, the dream. So here he is living as a king when he's not yet. But he's faithful now. And we see here through the trials, through the hard circumstances, God is preparing him for what he's preparing him for. He's making it hard for him now, so he learns strength and character so that when he is in a position of leadership, he has been trained to be a leader. Now let's look at verse 11 and 12. And it came to pass at about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. So right away, here's the cue. Something is wrong. Typically, there's other servants in the house. So Potiphar's wife now has set the stage to trap him. Just the two of them. No witnesses. This is not normal. This is, the spider's web. Verse 12. And she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. So we see one day she catches him by his cloak, his outer coat. He squirms out. He runs. He leaves her holding his coat. But if you think about it, he lost his coat, but he saved his character. However, she uses that as evidence against him. Now, look, how many times has a garment been used in Genesis, right? Here's another time a garment is being used. Now as evidence that Joseph had attempted to rape her. So here we see sometimes trying to avoid a temptation is not enough, right? Sometimes, I'm not going to sit by this person. I'm not going to be in a room alone. And, Billy Graham had the standard. Even Vice President Mike Pence has the standard. Never to be in a room with someone who's not his wife, alone in a room with someone who's not his wife. And I got that in The Preacher and his problems in seminary. All those situations where, hey, listen, somebody comes for counseling and you're the only one in the building and it's raining outside. The answer was, you wait outside, let her be in the building. It's all those types of things where you have to watch out and put the fence up and put the guard out so that you can't get accused falsely, like that ever happens, right? Accused falsely, or even if you're just accused, it can ruin your reputation, whatever happens. So sometimes avoiding temptation is not enough. Like Joseph, we turn and we run. That's what he does. Yet he still suffers for doing righteousness. Right? It doesn't mean you're going to get a reward. Sometimes it means you suffer more because you do right, and that's what's happening with Joseph now. Let's look at verse 13. And it came to pass, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in an Hebrew unto us to mock us. You'll notice the change of pronouns here. She'll say us, and then me. He came unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he had heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant which thou hast brought. Now she's blaming her husband. The Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us, there's the pronoun, came unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which he spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. Now here is where some commentators will say, why was he angry? Was he angry at his wife? Was he angry at Joseph and losing his best employee? I don't think he believed his wife, because if that were the case, he had the power and the authority to kill him. Instead, he puts him in a federal prison, the king's prison. Okay, look at verse 20. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in prison. So again, even for doing righteousness, you can still suffer, and that's what he did. He did righteousness, and he did suffer for his obedience. His determined resistance led to a more determined attack. That's just the nature of sin and righteousness, right? You try to do right, then evil tries to do worse to you. So now for the second time, Joseph is now imprisoned because he was faithful to his master. First time with his brothers, the second time now. He was faithful to his father. But here's something that we sometimes forget. He came back from being put in a pit and put in charge of a officer's house. He came back. And so as he's being put in prison now, looking back, saying, you know what, I was in the pit before, and God raised me before. God can raise me now. And so this building of his character, this building of his faith is through the trial. And that's why James in the New Testament could say, count it all joy, because this is for your good, to develop your faith and your patience. That's exactly what it's developing in Joseph here. Now let's look at verse 21 to 23 as we close it out here. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. I have a deep suspicion that Potiphar says to the prison guard here, the warden, this guy's good. You watch him, right? He's good. So I think he gets a good reference from Potiphar. Verse 22, and the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. Here's the guy with the Midas touch, and now he's doing it again in federal prison, in the king's prison. So now God is repositioning now, right? Revenge tried to happen with Potiphar's wife, but God is now repositioning. Yeah, you're going to try to put him in prison, but guess what? I'm going to make him the master of the prison too. And so Joseph and the jailer, he gains favor with the jailer, and he places him in charge of the entire prison. So here's the cream rising to the top, no matter what the circumstance. Here's Joseph making lemonade out of the lemons, and his character being built through trial, through suffering, and his God's leader being proven. He's tested and proven. So what principles do we take out of this as we go into prayer here? The key to Joseph's conduct is his character, and his character is based upon his hope in God and his word and God's will for his life. God's presence, the awareness of God's presence and God's purpose for his life helps him to overcome temptation, helps him to overcome trial. Okay, those two P's, God's presence and God's purpose, helps him to overcome, and that's true with us as well. And as a prisoner and as a slave, think about this. If it were you or me, we could have easily chosen to be negative, sarcastic. We could have easily chosen to be, hey, I tried to do right, and yet I'm in prison. I tried to do right, yet I'm a slave. We could wallow in pity and hopelessness, but instead, Joseph does the best with what's given to him. In terms of, here's your little responsibility. You're faithful in little, I'll give you much. That's the parable of the talents. You're faithful in little, I'll give you much. You're faithful in little, I'm going to make you ruler over much. So here we can just, pull that from the text and say, look, at work, at school, at our house, if we have the same spirit, the same attitude, and the same desire to be faithful, to be diligent, to know God's purpose, to know God's presence is with us, everything we touch prospers. That's what happened with him, and that's what we can happen with here. Let's look at this last verse to close. Turn to 1 John chapter 3, verse 21 and 22. Though, again, these chapters don't show or have direct quotes of Joseph's prayer life, they do show his walk, his devotional life, and his faith, which no doubt translated into his prayer life. How could he be so confident and bold when he resisted temptation, right? Lie with me. I can't. My boss and my God. He was already prepared to face the temptation. Look at 1 John chapter 3, verse 21 and 22. Here's how the Apostle John would describe how Joseph is living. Beloved, if our heart condemn us not, then have we confidence toward God. And whatsoever we ask, we receive of him, because we keep his commandments and do those things that are pleasing in his sight. Here's Joseph trying to be pleasing in God's sight, not sinning, not betraying his master, and not sinning against God. And because he's living righteously, verse 21, if our heart condemn us not, if we have a clear conscience, okay, because he's walking to please God. He's not going to live like the world would live. He's walking with a clear conscience. He's not indulging in secret sin. He's doing what God has put in front of him to do and being faithful with it. He's not complaining about the circumstances of life. He has a clear conscience. He is, as verse 21 says, if our heart condemn us not, he has confidence toward God. That word confidence there means boldness or outspokenness. Remember his response to the temptation? Sleep with me. Can't. I betray my master and my God. Boldness is outspokenness. And his outspokenness against temptation was because he had a clear conscience with God. And because he has a clear conscience with God, verse 22 is the prayer promise. Whatsoever we ask, we receive of him, because we keep his commandments and do those things that are pleasing in his sight. We can be confident not because of our righteousness, okay? But because his acceptance of us because of Jesus. But we can be confident when our heart doesn't condemn us, when God knows that we're trying to live righteously. And I think that's what Joseph is living here, a life of a clear conscience and confident with God. And we can bring that into our life of prayer this evening. Any questions or comments? Paul?
As you've read through this for us the last couple of weeks, I can't help but think that Joseph must have had a close daily communication with the Lord.
Yeah.
If he had just been living this on his own,
Yeah. So let me repeat that for those listening on TV at home. Paul said that with Joseph's living, it's impossible to not have a clear conscience and walk to please God without having a daily time with God. Absolutely right. And I think, with Jacob, with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, there were prayer requests, literal, direct prayer requests that they made, so we could talk about the prayer life of the patriarchs. Here, there is no prayer life given of Joseph. It's just his whole walk without the direct prayers. And so you can't have a direct prayer life that is confident without a righteous walk before God. And I think partially, it's assumed that he has a prayer life from verses 36, chapter 36 on, because of the way he walked and how God was with him, right? If he's not praying, God's not with you, right? So, it's a given without being directly stated. Okay, any other comments or questions? Let's look at your prayer prompt.